Hello, welcome to today's Sports Psychology Screencast. The focus is attributions. So we've already had a look at part one in a two-part series of screencasts on attribution. The first thing we had a look at is how we classify attributions using Weiner's attribution model. So in that previous screencast, we looked at this attribution grid here, and more specifically, we had a look at things, we had 4 types of attribution: ability, task, difficulty, effort, and we looked at how, using this model with the 3 loci, we looked at how you would classify them. For example, if we had ability as a reason for success or failure, in this case on the grid, it's saying we won because we were the better team. If that is an attribution, we would know that in order to double classify that, it's internal because it comes from within, and it's stable because it can't really change that much. So that is how we looked at the process of double classifying attributions using Weiner's attribution model. Now, at the end of the screencast, I kind of introduced this idea. Once we have an understanding of how to attribute, we can then understand why people attribute in these ways, and we're going to look at how we analyze the impact of these attributions. And what we looked at is to say that there are 3 psychological conditions that can be, I suppose, that will be the result of the way that people attribute success or failure. So we looked at 3 conditions. We looked at mastery orientation, this psychological mindset where somebody or an individual is motivated to become an expert. We also had a look at learned helplessness. So we had a look at learned helplessness, this idea that an individual, psychologically speaking, thinks that they are going to fail every time they go into a competitive situation. Okay, so it's kind of a negative mindset, I suppose. Finally, we go into this idea of a self-serving bias. And it kind of, is what it says in the tin, really. So it's a biased attribution that serves yourself in order to protect your self-esteem. So what we've got then is this idea that, a biased attribution is for failure, particularly failure. It can be success, but we focus on failure within this specification to protect confidence and self-esteem. So what we're saying then, somebody gives a reason for failure, they'll use or success, they'll use a quote. Weiner's attribution model allows us to academically classify those attributions. Once we've done that, this can lead to a condition, a psychological condition, or, once that happens, this then will have an impact on further psychological conditions as we study in the specification. So we then have to analyze the impact of these attributions, then these conditions, will have on motivation, confidence, pride, future expectations of success, or persistence. So basically what we've got then is this. We're going to now look at how we can move from classifying that leads to a psychological condition, therefore, what is the impact of those attributions and psychological conditions on motivation, confidence, pride, future expectations of success. So that's where we're going. If I just put into perspective now then, a couple of exam questions just to show you the importance of being able to analyse attributions. This is a 6-mark question that's come up in the past. So it's got performance use attributions. Then it says, discuss the impact of an individual's attributions following a failure in sport. So at that point, what are we going to need to do? Well, we know there's 4 attributions. What we then have to do is analyse the effective attributions from Weiner's attribution model and the ineffective attributions from Weiner's attribution model, and we have to be able to develop our points. A second example of a question that requires this higher order thinking is the following here. This is part 1 of a 10-mark question. So gives 2 attributions. It's slightly different here. It gives you the examples of an attribution. What you're required to do is then classify, double classify using Weiner's attributions, sometimes triple classify. Once that has happened, we're then in a position where we can move down to the next bit. So evaluate the use of the attributions above in relation to Weiner's model of attribution. So when we're evaluating it, that means we've got to develop it and say the good thing about it. And there might be some situations where the attributions that are being used are ineffective. And then we can look at how we critically evaluate that. So as you can see, it's not enough just to be able to classify an attribution type or an attribution example. We have to be able to develop that point, and we have to be able to develop the reasons why they're effective or ineffective. To do this, we are going to use an answer framework or a sentence development framework. So we're going to use something called BLT, okay, which is just going to allow us to build up our sentence, and I'll put an extra B on there, and I'll show you why in a minute. What does that mean then? So if you get if you're talking about an effective attribution, I'll give an example of an attribution here. So we've got I won because of ability. We won because we were the better team. That might be a specific example of an attribution. Now, in order to analyze the effectiveness of that attribution, we then need to be able to work through a process. So what we're going to do is use BLT. So what does that mean? We have to start by saying it's an effective or an ineffective attribution for success. In this case, ability is an effective attribution for success. Okay. Now, in order to get our development points here, we then have to go through a sentence progression that involves BLT, and I'll put this but at the end. So, because leads to, therefore, but. Now, if I explain specifically what that means, if what we have to do, as soon as we've given an attribution type, so in here, we've said ability, once you've done that, you then need to justify that attribution by saying how you classify it. Now, ability would then, if I was going to give an example that I have to classify using attribution model, ability is internal and it's stable. That's an effective attribution for success because it's internal and stable. Internal from within, stable doesn't change. Now, because of that, that will then lead to a psychological condition. So does it lead to mastery orientation? Does it lead to learned helplessness or self-serving bias? Now, in this case, it is mastery orientation. Then we have to say, okay, therefore, if you experience mastery orientation, what are the knock-on effects on your psychological condition? So we look at something like here, then it will increase, in this case, confidence, motivation, pride, future expectations of success, all these things. Now, once we've done that, there might be an opportunity at the end to say, but. So we might be able to critically evaluate the use of ability as an effective attribution strategy, okay? Because if we do that, so you then have to look at this idea, sorry if I just go back there, in this case, it could mean that it could make people complacent because they think they're always going to win and they always think it's not going to change. Okay, so that could be something that we have a look at as we go through. So ultimately, every sentence progression I'm going to go through and I'm going to model to you in this screencast. I would expect you to then start to slowly, I will take away the support in lessons, and you then need to make sure that you can develop an analysis of an attribution using this process. So, if we go on to here then, effective and ineffective success attributions. We'll start with success. I'm going to give you one effective, one ineffective success attribution. We'll look at the others in the class. So if I just very quickly go through here, effective success. If you are successful, there's a good way to be successful with regard to attributions. And that would involve you attributing success to internal factors. So anything that come, or any reasons that come from within you. So for example, effort or ability. Now, if we look at ineffective success attributions, if you're successful and you want to have a good effect on your motivation, you shouldn't be attributing success to external factors because those reasons are outside of you, okay? So they're outside of you, they're outside of your control particularly, so that puts it into a difficult position. So hopefully that's pretty straightforward. I just wanted to open it up from here. So what I'm going to do is go through one of each using the sentence or the paragraph progression structure that I talked to you about earlier. So let's start off then. Effective success attribution, let's start with this one, ability. So the first one is ability. I've put a quotation here. We won the basketball game because we are a very good team, okay? Now, once this happens, if I just leave that there for a second and say to you now, if I can ask you to just listen as I go through it and then make notes after. So once I've done this and I've stated an effective success attribution, now what I need to do is justify it, okay? So firstly, I make a decision. Is that effective? I've kind of told you at the top. This is an effective way to attribute success because. And then I go into my key section here. It's internal and stable. So the performer or the coach is personally responsible for the success and it doesn't change much. So what we've got in there is our key section to start with. Then we're in a position where we can move down to our next one. So once we've said this, if you remember what I said before, the next thing we have to refer to is leads to. Okay, so once we've said because, we then say leads to. So because of this, it leads to the condition of mastery orientation, where the performer is motivated to be an expert. Now, once we've done that, we've said it's a good attribution because classified it using one as model. Then we've said this leads to a psychological condition. And as a result of that psychological condition, we already know one of the things that increases. We've got motivation. But we can then start to add on some more. So if I said to you on here, therefore it increases motivation, confidence, future expectations of success. And then we're in a really, really good position. So we've now analysed why this attribution for success is effective. And then if we want to critically evaluate it, we could then say, as I said to you before, if you always say, the reason I won, I'm just better, I'm just better, I'm just better, that can sometimes, as a critical evaluation point, lead to complacency. Because sometimes people think, well, I'm the best, I'm always going to be the best, that's not going to change, it's stable. And that could sometimes make people complacent. So I'll put it into here, it could lead to complacency on there. Right, so as you can see, I've structured it like this. We identify the attribution and give an example of it. We say it's effective or ineffective. We then have to justify it by saying B, because, Al leads to, T, therefore, and then we go into but from there. Okay, and that gives us a little bit of way to critically evaluate at the end. It won't always be relevant. So that's one. Obviously, we could look at effort as well, but I'm just going to do one on the screencast, and then you can come back to the others in lessons. So let's have a look at ineffective success attributions then. So ineffective success attributions, as I said to you before, they're going to be external. So there's a bad way to be successful, and that's to say, you know, I was good because of something else. So in this case, let's go with luck. I won the race because 3 other people slipped over. So if I go for that, that is, as soon as we've done that, this will be an ineffective, or it's not an effective way to attribute success. So once I've done that, I've then made my opinion. I've then started to show whether it's effective or ineffective. Then I have to go through the process of saying because leads to therefore. So in that case, hopefully now people can see that and they will be able to use Wider's model to double classify it. Okay, so now we should be in a position where we can say it's not an effective way because it's external and unstable. And this, if we justify that, the performer is not personally responsible for its success, and it can change because it's unstable. So that is really difficult. If you're saying you're successful, what it's saying then is it's nothing to do with you, and next week it might do something different. So you're almost saying that, you know, that is going to obviously, therefore, have a really negative effect on our 3 to 4 key terms. So it can lead to learned helplessness. That is the condition where you think failure is inevitable next week because it's nothing to do with you and it changes. Therefore, it will lead to decreased confidence, motivation, and future expectations of success. So, you know, I look at that and say, you know, that'll be it for that one. We don't really need to have a but on that. But if I said to you on there, that is our ineffective success attributions. Now, once we've got that, we're then in a position where we need to start thinking about failure attributions. So again, we can have a look at task difficulty in the lesson as another ineffective success attribution, but you get the idea. Internal are good when you're successful or effective. External are not effective when you're successful. So now what we need to do is have a look at this idea of effective and ineffective failure attributions. Now this is a really, really interesting point that I do need you to pay good attention to. So if we start off with here then, effective failure attributions. So starting off, the best way to attribute failure is actually internal, but one specific internal attribution. The best way to fail is due to internal unstable factors such as effort. Now we'll look into this. The reason is because you are personally responsible for changing effort. Okay, it's internal, it's unstable, it's controllable. All of those 3 things make it really, really good, a good way to attribute failure. Let's have a look at the worst way to attribute failure. If you fail and you say, I lost because I am rubbish, I'm not good at this, I just can't do it, that's a really ineffective failure attribution. Because if you say, I lost because of internal stable factors, such as ability, this could be really problematic. Internal, stable. From within you, doesn't change. That is obviously going to have negative implications on your psychological mindset. Now, there are 2, one effective, one ineffective, and then finally we have one that can really, really point a bit, I suppose, be somewhere in the middle. It's a real critical analysis of an attribution. The final one we're going to have a look at is one, like I said, that you can analyze both ways more than any other. So we're going to have a look at this idea that I lost because of external unstable factors such as luck. Now, this is one of the most common attributions for failure. And it can be effective, but it can also be ineffective if it's used too much. And we'll have a look at this and how it links to a specific condition. So that's what we're going to have a look at. I'll give you one example of this, one example of this, one example of this, and then we'll look at these in more detail in lesson. So let's have a look. Okay, so if we have a look at the following then. So effective failure attributions then that will be associated with mastery orientation. So we have a look at our first one here then. So if we fail, there is a good way to fail, and this will help promote mastery orientation. So it is effort. So effort. We lost the netball game because we didn't try hard enough, or we lost the netball game because we could have worked a bit harder. Okay, so this is an effective way to attribute failure because, and it's directly linked to this classification that will allow us to really understand why it's the best way to fail, because it's internal, it's unstable, it's controllable. So what does that mean? It means the performer believes that they can be responsible for changing it. They can control the fact they change it. That's powerful. If you lose or you fail in something, whether that's an exam, whether that's a sports fixture, whatever it is, if you think to yourself, I could have worked harder, that is so powerful because you're taking the responsibility. If it changes, it's you, and you know you are responsible in control of changing it. That makes it such a good way to improve yourself. So this leads to obviously mastery orientation, which is that idea where you're motivated to be an expert, okay? And obviously it leads to this idea of self-improvement. So even though you fail, okay, what happens is it can still lead to an increased confidence, motivation, and future expectations of success. I mean, it could be that. I mean, you could say maintains your confidence, maintains your motivation, maintains your future expectations of success. And that is the ultimate way to attribute failure. The high achievers in the world, they don't look at anyone else. They don't care about anyone else. Now, it's human nature as soon as you fail to think it's someone else's fault, but eventually you'll come round to thinking those people who achieve will think, okay, I haven't done very well. I need to work harder, okay? That is it, okay? That's the reason why, because it really will give you that positive outlook for the future. Now, if we move on from there then, let's have a look at an ineffective failure attribution. So if we look at this then, the worst way to attribute failure is ability, okay? So we lost a basketball game because we're not very good. Now that can be difficult, okay? So if you do that, it's not an effective way to attribute failure because of the classification. In this case, it's internal like effort is, okay? But the difference between ability and effort is that it's internal and stable. Now because it's internal and stable, what that means is that you're personally responsible for the failure, and you might consider it impossible to change. Now, that gives it an element of permanency. It's permanent. Therefore, this will lead to this idea that the condition of learned helplessness, because learned helplessness is that belief that failure is always going to be inevitable. And there's no more reason for you to believe failure is inevitable if the reason you're attributing failure is to internal and it's stable, okay? Therefore, this will have a terrible effect on confidence, motivation, and future expectations of success. Now, there is a slight caveat on this, okay? And the caveat is this, that sometimes elite sports performers will use it as a motivational tactic. So they might say, I wasn't good enough today. But the key thing is, and I think what I just said there, I wasn't good enough today. Okay, so they are putting that as a temporary thing. So you're basically saying here, you can critically evaluate that, saying it can motivate elite performers if they say they're not good enough, okay? But it usually is a momentary thing. They're saying it is a moment, not saying it's going to be permanent in terms of that. So that's the way you can critically evaluate it as you move on. Okay, last one then, and I'm just going to introduce you to this. We're now going to look at the one attribution that is directly associated with the psychological condition of self-serving bias. Those biased attributions for failure that protect self-esteem, confidence, and motivation. So, failure, it has to be a failure attribution. I lost because of luck. We are going to then go through the process. It can be an effective attribution for failure because leads to, therefore, but. And the but is huge. And we'll have a look at that now. So, going in from here then, so attributions associated with self-serving bias. Okay, so this is a failure attribution, always a failure attribution. We lost the football game because it was windy and the ref was on their side. So this big can be effective attribution for failure because it's external, it's unstable. Those two things mean the reason is outside of the performer or the coach, okay? But the key thing is the instability or the fact that it's unstable. It can change. So what this does, because we have this idea here that it's external, unstable, and uncontrollable, so the person is not responsible for it, and it can change. Now, this can lead to this idea, I suppose, of a self-serving bias, okay, where you are biasly attributing your failure to protect your self-esteem. So what happens is it protects self-esteem, it protects confidence, it protects motivation, and it protects your kind of mindset of future expectations of success. Now, the but is huge here because of all the ones we've talked about, this has the biggest critical analysis opportunity. Why? Because this is the thing. If you are someone, we've already said, what is the best way to attribute failure? Well, it's effort, because effort is internal. It's unstable. Now, both luck and effort are unstable, so they can change. So that's why they're good to use. But the difference between effort and luck is that when you're talking about effort, you are personally responsible for changing. Now, sometimes when you're using a self-serving bias, the problem is that, however, the but is that if you are constantly blaming someone else, okay, it stops you looking on how you might improve. So what we've got here is as follows. So we've got it avoids responsibility. It could hide the real reason for failure, and it could, as a result of that, prevent that motivation to improve because it's always someone else. So basically what we're looking at there, they are the key critical evaluation points we are looking at. So please have a good look at those, and hopefully you can see how you build those conditions up, and you can analyze both success attributions, failure attributions, and then we've had a look at specific failure attribution linked with self-serving bias. Okay, thank you.